Morning. Morning. It has been really hot this past week. And I'm not sure if you all do this, but I know when I get really hot, I need something to drink. Like nothing makes me feel better on a hot day than a nice, ice, cold, refreshing drink. Now, maybe this thing's still on or something. We'll make sure that's not the case. We'll try that again. All right. Maybe we can take me down just a little bit volume-wise. Thanks. I'm pretty loud on my own. I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of person, when I get like a drink that's not a ball drink, like a fountain drink, I fill it up with a lot of ice. How many of you are the people who fill it up with a lot of ice? How many of you are the people who try and put as little ice as you can get away with? Yeah, okay. I'm in the minority here, that's fine. I like a lot of ice in my drinks, keep them nice and cold. Now, people who like a lot of ice find that there's one major problem on hot days. Ice melts. I oftentimes, after eating a lunch, will go over and fill up my drink one last time, get a soda with a lot of ice, and I'll be heading out on my way. Now usually, oftentimes, after lunch, I'll have like some errands to run at the store. And I get to the store, and all of a sudden, I am put face in front of this decision before me. Either I have to carry this drink throughout the entire store with me, or I leave it in my car. I really don't want to carry the drink through the whole store, and I don't know if I need both hands, and I'm only going to be in the store for a minute anyways, so I might as well just leave it in my cup holder, right? Well, the problem is, I go into the store, and it's never a minute. You go into the store, and you can't find the thing because it's in the wrong aisle, and you get to the cash register and realize there's only one open, even though there's 20 available, and you just kind of wait and wait and wait, and finally you get back to the car. And what's happened to my nice ice-cold, refreshing soda? All the ice is melted and it's become watered down. Have any of you drinking watered down soda? It doesn't taste good. And almost every time you get to it, it's not really cold anymore, it's lukewarm. It's been watered down. And I found that it doesn't really matter what soda, what drink I put in there before I went to the store. By the time I come back, it basically tastes like water with a bad aftertaste. And I tell you this story about my soda experience because it reminded me a lot of a conversation I overheard this week. I was sitting in a coffee shop working on this sermon, and it was in one of those moments when I'm trying to concentrate, nothing's coming to me in the moment, and this really loud, but probably nice set of older ladies walk in and sit at the table right next to me. And when someone's that loud, it's really hard to focus. But something interesting happened. And that was they sat down to play a game of cribbage. For those of you who don't know, cribbage is a card game. What happened next was there was these two young Muslim women who walked in. And these two young Muslim women walked right up to these older ladies and started asking them about the game. Well, what it was, what was going on. Well, soon, they get into a whole conversation about life. And I don't mean to be an eavesdropper, but they're right there, and they're loud, and it's kind of interesting, so I paid attention. And they start talking about life. They start talking about, what are their families like? What are their cultures like? One of the Muslim women was from Saudi Arabia, the other one from Kuwait. They're comparing stories with the older women from here. And then one of the older women said something that caught my ear. She talked about her ex-husband who used to be a Muslim. And she was saying, She was a Catholic woman, and she used to be married to a Muslim man. And what was interesting was that she was always disappointed that he wasn't more forward in his faith. She always kind of felt bad that her husband was very passive in his Muslim faith. And I thought that was very odd, being that she was a Catholic woman. And then she said something that kind of made it make sense. She said, well, really, if you think about it, all faiths are basically the same. We all basically have the same kind of thing. There's a reason why we're here. We have things to do. There's a creator of some sort. And the Muslim girls are, agreeable. And they're like, yeah, that's true. And now, why that caught my ear was because I've studied world religions. And in my studies of world religions, I will tell you, very few faiths are actually alike. Very few religions are the same. In fact, there are religions that believe in multiple gods. There are religions that believe in no gods. There are religions that think that to be all you need to be, you have to learn how to detach yourself from everything in this world. And then there are religions that say, to be all you can be, you need to become attached to things and love things. There are all sorts of religions. And to make the claim that they're all basically the same was kind of absurd. But then I started thinking about this soda. And to a degree, it actually started making sense. Because when you have enough melted ice in any soda, when you water down any soda enough, it kind of tastes the same as every other watered down soda. When you water down any particular religion enough, it kind of feels just like any other religion. When it's kind of gotten to that state where it's diluted and lukewarm. I mean, it just tastes like water with a bad aftertaste in soda form. In religions, it's just all kind of seems the same kind of thing. And the Bible actually talks to us about what it means when Christianity becomes lukewarm. I wanted to read you guys a little excerpt before we got into our main passage. This is out of the book of Revelations. Now, Jesus is talking through John. He's talking to John, who's writing the book of Revelation, and he's writing a letter specifically to a church called the Church of Laodicea. The Church of Laodicea, in many ways, many scholars look at it and say, wow, this is the Church of America. Let me read you the excerpt. In Revelations 3, starting in verse 15, it says, I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. Would that you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say I am rich and I have prospered, and I am in need of nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. We live in a country that kind of fits this bill fairly snugly. Most Christian churches in this country, they have plenty of prosperity. They have plenty of riches. They don't feel like they really need anything. And what Jesus says to them is, you are lukewarm. How many of you like tea? Anyone like tea in the room? Any coffee drinkers, maybe? How many of you have a preference, hot or cold tea? Right? Like hot tea people, raise your hand. Cold teas? People like cold tea? Same with coffee, like, iced coffee versus hot coffee. Now, how many of you, your preferred way to drink a drink is just room temperature? I love coffee. I love hot coffee. I love cold coffee. My dad's not a cold coffee drinker. That's fine. I love both. But I will not touch a glass of room temperature coffee. That's what it's like with Jesus here. He's saying, you're neither hot nor you're cold. You're lukewarm. I want to spit you out of my mouth. I want to get rid of you. And that's kind of the church that the American culture, the churches in America are built on. And that can be interesting, but also kind of scary, because while we are a Chinese church, we are a Chinese church living in the same prosperous, rich country that made the American churches the way they are. And what makes it even scarier is at the seminary, I get to know quite a few of these people who've started these churches that are now acting very lukewarm. And a lot of them start on a really solid foundation. A lot of them start on the same solid foundation of the gospel. And they have good intentions. And yet over time, they get to this place where they're lukewarm. And the church just has this watered down feeling. And you're not getting what you need to get out of it. And the scary thing is, for a church like us, it wouldn't be that hard for us to eventually grow into that kind of church. We are a small church. And God has placed us in a position where we get to build our church. And the question that faces all of us is, what kind of church are we going to build? Are we going to be the kind of people who just grow from a solid foundation into a lukewarm church that looks no different than the rest of the world? Into a kind of religion that just looks basically the same as any other religion? Are we the kind of church who's going to build something more? I would like you all to turn with me to the book of 1 Corinthians, because Paul is instructing the Corinthian church about how they need to build their church. We're going to be looking at chapter 3. But before we get any further, I'd like to pray. Dear God, thank you so much that you have brought us all here today. God, we ask that today, if we hear things that are hard for us to hear, you would soften our hearts if we need to hear it. I pray, God, that as we dive into some difficult texts, God, you would still show us the love underneath it, the grace and the mercy. God, as we hear and start to understand what kind of church you want, I pray that your Holy Spirit would convict us and push us towards that to become that kind of church. And God, we ask that anything that's not of you this morning would be left behind so that we can hear truly what you have for us. In your powerful name, I pray.
Amen.
Amen. Now, I want to give you a little bit of context before we get right in, because without context, you're going to be very thrown off. Paul is writing to this church in Corinth. This is a church he lived in for a year and a half. He's the one who planted the church. He started the church here. And in Corinth, where he lived for a year and a half, he spent time being a missionary. He'd go around evangelizing. He'd teach some. But eventually, he had to move on to other churches. And after he left, they eventually got a new pastor. His name was Apollos. Apollos was known for being a talented preacher and speaker. That's what he was known for. And yet, in the beginning, he had to get some theology corrected, but he became just as effective in a different way, but just as effective as Paul. Now, what the people in the church of Corinth did, though, instead of just being happy that they have another person to continue the church, they started getting competitive. They started getting into groups. They started kind of forming these cliques and these clumps. And some of the groups would be, oh man, we're the group that's for Apollos. He is such a talented preacher, way more so than Paul ever was. And then you had the group where, Paul was the guy who started our church. We need to be loyal to him. And some people over here, they were going, Stan, Cephas, for you guys who don't know, Cephas was Peter. Man, he's the head of the church in Jerusalem. He's the guy we should be loyal to. And they started arguing about which group was better. They started getting fights about who was following which human leader. And at this point in the text, Paul has already said, listen, the way you were acting is worldly, fleshly, and infantile. You were acting like a bunch of babies. That's what Paul is saying to this church in Corinth. And it's right after that we're jumping into our text today. He is frustrated. He has had it. And that's where we start, and we're going to pick up in verse 5. And it says, in chapter 3 of 1 Corinthians, verse 5, "What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building." You can almost see Paul's frustration in the beginning. I mean, you can imagine him walking into the church like, what are you saying that you're for Apollos and you're for Paul? Don't you understand? It doesn't work that way. I am not in competition with Apollos. We're on the same team. I am not in competition with Peter. We're all on the same team. And furthermore, we are all only servants. We aren't the people who has given you salvation. We are servants of Jesus Christ. Servants can't have servants. And I think at first we said we don't think that we really connect with this as a church, as a people. I think sometimes when you really think about it, we do. Don't we get caught up following human leaders instead of following Jesus, who really matters? We start idolizing speakers. We start idolizing preachers. I'm going to show up on the Sunday when Tom's preaching. He's the man. You got it, Tom. We start idolizing the people who lead the church. I love it when this deacon leads worship. Oh man, I can't believe my favorite translator's translating today. That's something I can get excited about. And then it goes beyond our churches too, to the books we read. Oh man, I love Francis Chan. Someone else going, you read Francis Chan? Are you kidding me? And then other people going, who's Francis Chan? You get these competitive groups where we start following human leaders. We start idolizing this worship group or this worship group. And all these human leaders of the church are the people we start idolizing, and we stop looking past them to Jesus. And we don't realize what Paul is trying to get across to them. Why do we idolize these humans? And I believe it's because we have the wrong idea of what church is. What is church? If someone were to ask you that question, what is church? Would you be like, well, it's this building. I go there Sundays and Fridays if I'm not too tired. I get to hang out with people I like. We get to talk about Jesus. It's all a good thing. I love it. Because if that's our idea of church, then we actually have the wrong idea of church. Because we get this idea of church that it's something for us to go and see what we can get out of it. Where you show up and you expect the pastor just to be entertaining, And if you don't really get entertained enough week by week, well, you just find a new church. You show up if the worship's not moving enough, find a better worship team. You show up, you see what the people can do for you. It's all about you. What can I get? That's the consumer Christianity that is so pervasive in our country. This idea that the Christian life, this Christian church, it's about what we do when we get there so that what we can get out of it. And that is not church. In that Christian mindset, there are two kinds of Christians. You have the Christian leaders, the speakers, the pastors, the deacons, the worship leaders. They're the Christian leaders, the Bible study leaders. And then you have the Christian audience. And there's a two level of Christians. And it's okay if I'm not a leader, because I'm just an audience member. That's what church is. There's two kinds of Christians. You're either a leader or an audience member. I'm fine being an audience member. But a church isn't a place where you come to be entertained. And a church is a lot less about what you're getting out of it than what you're putting into it. A church isn't about showing up at a certain place on Sundays or Fridays. church is about a group of people who all have roles. If you notice in the passage, specifically speaking, it says, we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. We're all a part of that building. And we're all servants. There's not a higher servant or a lesser servant. Because I preach on Sundays sometimes, that doesn't make me any higher than someone who leads Bible study. Someone who leads Bible study is no higher than someone who's cooked and prepared for us for our love feast. We got to realize that each one of us has a role that God is calling us to put forth into this thing called church. Church isn't something that you just come to. The fact is, we have to stop just coming to church. And we need to start becoming a church. Most churches in this country feel often very watered down like that soda. And you know why that is? It's because they have a lot of Christians, watered down Christians, who are diluting it. Lukewarm Christians who don't add anything to the flavor, they just show up and take from the resources and sit in the audience. Lukewarm Christians build lukewarm churches. Is that the kind of church we want to build? Each of us have an assignment. Each of us have a role. And if you don't believe me, let me prove it to you. Let's look back at the scriptures. Let's look at verse 10. It says, according to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, each one's works will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will test what sort of work each of us has done. Each of us is responsible. And this is where Paul is really laying down the hammer on the Corinthian church. Because what he is saying is, if you guys want to stay a lukewarm church, keep doing what you're doing. Keep just showing up and taking. If you want to be a church that's for God, you have to stop being a consumer. If we want to build a church that actually stands apart in this day and age, that's a lot harder. Because that requires each of us working into a role. And we have to stop coming to church. We need to start becoming the church. And here's how we do that. We need to realize that we are all builders. At verse 10, which we just read, it says, Paul laid the foundation like a master builder. And mind you, it says he laid the foundation by the grace of God. It's not something that Paul somehow earned the right to lay down this foundation. He didn't deserve this right. God allowed him to do that work. If you're thinking to yourself, I don't know if I really deserve to play a certain role. I don't know if I deserve to be this kind of leader in the church. None of us do. I don't deserve to be up here preaching to you. I am not qualified. I have way too many sins and mistakes in my past. But it's only by God's grace that I can be here in this role. And that's the case for all of us in the church. We aren't worthy. But we have a God who gives us grace, who allows us to take up these roles. And what Paul did was he laid the foundation for this church. He was a missionary to this group. Now let me tell you something about foundations. In college, I had this group of friends, and we'd always try and spy out, whatever the local student kind of thing that was happening on campus it was. And one day we found a concert that was in the middle of the park at UNC. And we were walking up to this concert, and to be honest, I don't even remember who was playing. The music wasn't really that good. But what I do remember is that in the back of the concert area, in the middle of the field, they had a bunch of games. Among the games was this game called Giant Jenga. How many of you know what Jenga is? For those of you who don't know what Jenga is, typically speaking, you get about a tower about this high of individual pieces of wood stacked in groups of threes, and you have this tower, and you and your friends take turns trying to pull out a piece of wood without letting the tower fall, right? Well, in Giant Jenga, they use 2x4s, about this big. And the tower stacks about that high. That was Giant Jenga. And I got a brilliant idea, at least I thought it was. They had 2 sets. I was going to make super giant Jenga. Try and build the tower twice as high, about that high. That was my goal, get these blocks, keep building them up and building them up. Eventually we got it to stand, but I'm going to be honest. It took us way longer to actually build that than it did for us to lose while playing to it. And here's the most crucial thing we found is building it. And that was the foundation. Those first level, the 3 pieces of wood at the very bottom, if they weren't even, it wouldn't stand. And when you built on that foundation, if you put down wood that was misaligned to the foundation, you wouldn't make it to building the whole tower. It was actually a lot of hard work. And each piece that got built on it was a lot of effort and a lot of trying to get it to work. And our foundation, according to this passage, the only foundation for a Christian church is the gospel. He says, and this is right here, let each take care how he builds upon it, for no one can lay a foundation than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Jesus is the foundation. Jesus, his life, the fact that he came to this earth as fully God, fully man, his death on the cross for our sins after he led a perfect life to take the place of us in the death that we deserve, his resurrection, and in the fact that when we believe and put faith in Jesus and what he did for us, it is not by our works, it is by grace alone that we are saved. That is the gospel. That is Jesus. And it's on that foundation that every true church stands. Any church built on any other foundation is not God's church. It's not God's temple. Any other church, any other foundation other than the gospel is not God's. Now, the unfortunate thing for us is that you can have an amazing foundation and from there not do so well at building on it. And that's what we are concerned with. Paul laid a good foundation for the Corinthian church. He knew their foundation was solid. And I can speak to this church. We have the right foundation. We do. It's how we're going to build on this foundation that's going to matter next. Look back with me. It says, now if anyone builds, this is verse 12, on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, each one's work will become manifest. He lists 6 materials here. Now, they're not the typical building materials. He's not listing steel beams and things like that. What he's doing is he's listing these precious materials. That's the first 3. Those are 3 materials that will survive fire. And these are actually 3 materials that we find in the description of Solomon's temple for God. The second 3 materials that we have here are the materials that are going to get burnt away. And it says each person is going to build with these materials, and on that day, what's the day? We're talking Judgment Day. Judgment Day is a day that every one of us will see. But if we have the right foundation, none of us who have the right foundation have to actually worry about not being saved. With the right foundation, we are all saved. But even with the right foundation, you could waste your life building things that were going to get burned away. But for all of us who build right, build the church right, build with our role, with our talents in the way of God, we're going to be rewarded for that on that day. And that's good news. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, this is in verse 14, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved as though through fire. There's a lot of people that are building in the wrong way. And now how do we know if we're building the right way? Because guess what? While you're building, a lot of times you don't even realize it, which way you're building on this foundation. But here's the key. Like with giant Jenga, how you build needs to be aligned with that foundation, with the truth of the gospel. I'll give you an example. First, you can have two different people trying to lead worship music. The first kind of person is building with the gospel. They are getting up on stage not so that you can be amazed by their singing ability, but so that they can praise God and help lead you to praise God. That is building with the gospel intention in mind. Or you can have someone lead the same song with the same words, but it's really all about how well you think of them. You can have someone lead a Bible study with a good godly motive, the godly motive of the gospel, where you are trying to share the knowledge of God with others for his kingdom. Or you could be leading a Bible study just so that everyone else sees you and thinks, wow, he's a good Christian, he's really smart. You could preach like I'm doing today. You could preach with the heart of, I need to share the truth of Jesus. Or you could preach with the heart of, I hope everyone thinks I'm really amazing with how I'm preaching. I do, sometimes. But on the day in heaven, the judgment day, he will take me, he will take Josh, he will say, Josh, here is what you have done for me. And I will see all the works that were in the right purpose and the works that will stand. And everything else is going to be burned away. And I'm afraid a lot of Christians in this country today, when they see their works, they're going to realize they made all of it out of straw. And although they're saved, everything they thought they were building is gone. And that is a tough place to be. Now, in verse 16, Paul becomes very serious because that kind of building can cause other problems. In verse 16, it says, do you not know that you are God's temple and God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy and you are that temple. Now, when he's saying you are that temple, sometimes in the Bible he means individually. In this case, he means corporately. I don't have time to prove it, but you'll have to trust me. He's talking to the group of Christians. You are the temple. Anyone who destroys it, God will destroy him. Now, this is kind of confusing because I thought this letter was to a bunch of Christians. What does it mean that God's going to destroy someone if they destroy the temple? I mean, is he talking about outsiders maybe coming in and destroying the temple? I mean, he could, but I doubt it. He seems to be talking about misbuilding in such a way it just causes destruction. And I know a lot of you might be going, Josh, what does it mean that he will destroy him? And I'm going to be completely candid with you for a moment. Full disclosure, I don't entirely know. I don't know what God means in this verse. But I think we can all agree that God will destroy him doesn't sound good. It sounds pretty scary. A lot of times we like to take verses like this and we try and wiggle our way around, use every exegetical maneuver to try and make ourselves more comfortable with the verse. And sometimes I don't think that's what God has in mind. He wants us to sit and be uncomfortable with something we don't understand. And that's actually for the best. And we have to learn to trust him. And it's verses like this where I may not know what he means, but I sure know that I don't want to be involved with anything that destroys his temple. And I hope that that's a feeling that you all share. That means we need to build carefully. As we go on to verse 18, he talks a little bit more and gives a few more warnings to wrap up the chapter. He says, "Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you thinks he is wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is folly with God, for it is written, He catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, and they are futile. So let no one boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, or the world, or life, or death, or the present, or the future. All are yours, and you are Christ, and Christ is God's. Let no one deceive himself and call himself wise." What is so interesting about this is we have this tendency as human beings in our worldliness to try and say we know it all, we have it all together, we know what we need to know. And we try and use the world's wisdom and apply it to the church and how to be smart in the church. And what God's saying is, if you think you know, you better darn forget it. Because that's going to throw you off. What the world calls wisdom, God calls foolishness. And guess what? For us who are living in the way that God lives, as chapter 1 showed us, the world's going to call foolish. The two don't go together that well. A lot of times, when you're playing out your role in the church and you're being involved with ministry, the world is going to call you foolish. I remember the first time I got to call my grandma on the phone to talk to her about the idea of me becoming a pastor. First thing out of her mouth, before anything else, was, "Josh, it's hard to be a pastor. It's really competitive. Your cousin Jay's going to be a doctor." "No, Grandma, I'm going to be a pastor. I'm going into ministry." "Well, Josh, a lot of pastors end up getting divorced because it's really hard on a marriage." "Grandma, I'm going into ministry." "I don't know, Josh. Maybe you should be looking for a backup. Did you know that your cousin Jay is going to become a doctor?" They don't get it. They see someone who devotes their life to ministry and says, "That's foolish. How are you ever going to make it with that?" How many of us do that too, though? We have that mentality. Let me ask you, if your student today came up to you and said, and after getting accepted into Purdue University, or maybe NYU, or USC, they said, "Mom, Dad, I don't really want to go to college. I want to go to Africa and be a missionary." How many of you would freak out a little? They're throwing away their life for this. And that's our gut reaction, because we're holding on to this wisdom of the world where we have this idea of what's best. This school, that's what's best. Getting this much money per year, that's what's best. And we're stuck in this worldly wisdom, and to actually let go and trust God in the call to ministry is a lot harder. But God calls foolish the things that the world called wise. And in the end, what is more foolish? Trying to control your life through worldly wisdom, or trusting the God who knows the way your life will go? As the church, we need to be careful to not do what the world does just because that's how the world's doing it, if we want to be different. The world argues over things like human leadership. Here Paul says, right in verse 21, "Let no one boast in men, for all things are yours." Don't be wasting your time boasting in one leader or another. Don't argue over me, Peter, or Apollos. Everything already belongs to you because you are in Jesus. And Jesus is God's. And through Jesus, everything has been given to you. There's no need for us to compete. We're on the same team. Paul is telling the Corinthian church to grow up. And I wonder if Paul was here today, would he be telling our church the same thing? Now, I will say we have a lot of people in our church who step up in amazing ways. I don't want to downplay that. We have a lot of incredible volunteers in this church. I see the way that they care about people. I see the way they love each other. I see the way that they spend time and go out of their way for one another. That is amazing. But I also know that out of all the people who do those things, we still have a lot of people that choose not to. You just have too busy of a schedule. I mean, you have to get this student to this practice at this time, that student to this practice at that time. You have the thing on Thursday that you cannot miss. And then there's the stuff, later on. And then at the end of it, you're exhausted. At the end of the day, what it comes down to is you have not set time aside to play your role in the church, to play your part in this church. The time isn't going to set itself aside. That's for you to do. I used to be in theater growing up. We did a lot of theatrical shows. There's always one night that every theater student always felt nervous about, felt anxious about. And that was called Special Run-Through. Now, on Special Run-Through, it was the one night where everyone had to have every single line correct. So in order that, at the end of the night, Mr. Skelsey, my theater teacher, would say, "We have a show." And here's how it worked. He would start the show from the beginning. If anyone messed up in the entire show, he would say, "Start over." And we'd start over the show. We would start at oftentimes 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And before they changed the rules, they would have us go all the way to midnight sometimes. Anytime anyone messed up, you came in at the wrong time. You screwed up a line. You said, something weird, and maybe replaced the word "but" with and all these tiny deals. You forgot to go over to check the cabinets, like you were told to on stage. Anytime someone screwed up, start over. We got so sick of hearing "start over." And here was what it came down to. Those nights went smoothly when everyone knew their role and performed it to their best. Those nights went terribly when we had 1 or 2 members of the cast who didn't try. They were watered down. They were just showing up. They didn't have their lines memorized. They didn't have their entrances and exits memorized. They would be the ones who would drag everything down. We're a church, and we all have roles in this church. And why this really strikes home with me is because for the past 3 months, even though we've been good in so many ways in this church, I've showed up to coworker meetings. And for the past 3 months, it's been me and the deacons. And it's just us. I remember when I started coming here, and those coworker meetings were filled with a lot of people, a lot of leaders who didn't always get along, who often argued, but they were there because they cared about the church and they wanted to build the church. Those coworker meetings are for us as leaders. If you're a leader in this church and you care about how this church is built, you will be there. And it might take a little bit of extra time every month on the second Sunday. But if you care about your church, be a leader. Play your role. And maybe you're not in charge of the youth ministry. Maybe you know who is, though, and you can help them out. Maybe you're not in charge of children care. Maybe you're not in charge of the love feast. But you know that you have a role to play, and it's your responsibility to step up. And when we step up, we build the church. We build the church on the foundation of gospel, and we build something that lasts for eternity. That's the reward in heaven we get. I'd like to close us in prayer. Dear God, thank you.